Hey everyone! So this is a very special video today because not only are we going to talk about the theory of betting, but it's also the first video I filmed since my Upswing hoodie came through in the post. So all round it's going to be a joyous occasion for everyone. So the aim of this video is going to be to explain betting decisions on a very deep level. Before the advent of solvers, I used to very much think of poker as a game of having a value range and a bluff range. So you think about the river and you bet your value and you bet your bluffs, and that's still, vaguely for the most part true. If as we went back to the turn, I would think about, okay, so now we've got some thinner value hands, some value hands that are going to check the river, some value hands that are going to bet the river, most likely on a blank turn, on a blank river, sorry, and so on. And then so let's get some bluffs into our turn range, which match up to those two different sets of value hands, and then go back again to the flop and do the same thing again. And I was struggling, to be honest, to really make that work and make it coherent and get the value ranges and the bluff ranges set up correctly so that we've got the right amount of value and bluffs. And I was just, as everyone else was really at that time, just kind of doing my best and trying to come to some sort of version of coherent ranges. But then solvers came out, and you started to see that you don't just have this block of hands that are value and this block of hands that are bluffs, and this very clear distinction between hands which are betting and hands which are checking 100% of the time on earlier streets I'm talking about. So I wrote I wrote a document about this concept, this theory of betting, just to try and help myself to understand what was going on and why my previous concepts on how betting ranges should be constructed were wrong, why the solvers were giving different results. So I want to go through it. I know some of you will be very comfortable these days with the idea that you're betting sort of a ton of different hands with differing frequencies, but still I hope that you'll still take something from it and really get down to a deep understanding of why this is the case, and that will help you sort of move going forwards in terms of not just playing correct strategies, but understanding why they are, and then therefore being able to apply it to different situations more easily and so on. But this will be the most theoretical and least practical video of the whole course, I would say. So if you're watching it and you just hate this kind of stuff and whatever else, feel free to just watch it through at a very fast speed, or skip to the end for the conclusions or whatever. Or, I mean, just don't watch it at all if you don't want. You paid for the course, so you can do what you like. But I hope that you'll find it helpful. Throughout my poker career, I definitely felt that one of my edges was in trying to understand the game at the deepest level I could. And it's one of those things that's sort of frustrating, because on a day-to-day basis, you can understand the game much better than your opponent, but they might have found just this fairly basic strategy that works pretty well, and you're sort of struggling away and like having this close match with someone, and you're like, they just don't understand like 10 concepts that I understand. This is so unfair. But I think first of all, in order to have that sort of basic strategy that works well, you have to have come across it, and most people who don't have a deep understanding of the game just never really come across this sort of base game that allows them to have a lot of success. But then even those who do get some success without a huge amount of understanding, they tend to find it very difficult to have any sort of longevity in the game, because as other people's games change, what works no longer works, and they don't really understand why they were doing what they were doing, so they struggle to adjust properly, and you get these people who are sort of a flash in the pan, and they just have success for a few months or a year or a couple of years maximum, and then the game moves on and they get left behind. So I think my sort of understanding of the game, while you can understand this deep concept and it can be very difficult to apply on a day-to-day basis, it just keeps in your mind where the game's going in the future and what you need to be on the lookout for as to what things might improve your game, what sort of software you might want to get developed or look for if it's out already, and so on. And that just helped me to sort of keep up at the top of the game for as long as I did. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, but let's go into it, and I apologize in advance if you don't. Okay, so why do we bet? We're sitting there at a poker table, we've got a hand in front of us, there's a board in front of us, we're deciding whether to bet or to check. So the most basic and obvious statement we can make is that when our hand has a higher EV of bet than an EV of check, we bet. And of course, if the EVs are the same, we probably bet sometimes and check sometimes. But the important thing to note here is that we're not just betting when the EV of bet is greater than 0, we're betting when it's greater than the EV of check. And this sounds obvious and everybody kind of knows it, but I think it would be surprising the amount of decisions that have been made in the history of poker, even at quite a high level, that have kind of forgotten this concept. And I freely admit myself, earlier in my career, I would do work and find out that, oh, it's plus EV to bet here. Either, it's plus EV to 4-bet here, for example, so I'm going to 4-bet, and kind of forget that, sure, it is plus EV to 4-bet, but it also would have been higher EV to flat the 3-bet. Another one will be if I'm, say, C-betting, then, people, I'm like, oh, this is a plus EV C-bet with air, so I'm just going to C-bet really high frequency, and sure it was, but it was also a plus EV check with air because of being able to hit on future streets and profitably bluff on future streets. So bear that in mind. It's very important to sort of have that in mind at all times. And breaking this down, the EV of betting for our hand is the weighted sum of the EV of betting versus every hand in our opponent's range. So if we've got Jack 10 on a Jack 4 deuce board, then we need to, our EV of betting Jack 10 is the EV of our betting Jack 10 when our opponent has Queen Jack, and plus our EV of betting when they have Jack 9 and all the other hands that they can have. And if they've got Queen Jack twice as often as they got Jack 9, we just have to weight that accordingly. Obviously, we're not going to work this out in real time or in any other time. This is not how we work it out, but that's how sort of on a deep level it works. We're betting this hand and our opponent has a range of hands, and this weighted sum of the EV versus each of those individual hands our opponent has gives us our overall EV of betting. And our EV of checking is the same. It's the weighted sum of the EV of checking versus every hand in our opponent's range. And what we're going to do in this video is going to break down these EVs further and create a formula, not a formula that we're ever going to use in sort of a real sense, but a formula that will hopefully help us to understand the fundamental factors going into the decision of whether to bet. So we're going to introduce these variables. And you can see in these slides I've got stuff in red which is relating to betting and green which is relating to checking, just because hopefully that will make things a little bit easier. So we can split our EV of betting into these 4 sort of variables here in red. The first is the money earned from villain folding immediately versus our bet. So this is commonly known as fold equity. Then we've also got, and I apologise for the letters used here. Turns out it's kind of difficult to find some intuitive letters to use here because they're all sort of money and won and lost and folding later and earlier in hands and so on. So anyway, I've got these letters, but so I've called capital S money earned at showdown after we bet now. So we bet now, villain doesn't fold, because if villain does fold, that's included in our F. But if villain doesn't fold to our bet now, and then we later in the hand end up seeing a showdown, then any money won or lost versus all the villain's different hands there are encompassed in this variable S. W we have is money earned from villain folding later in the hand after we bet now. So we bet, villain doesn't fold, and then later in the hand, villain does fold. So we're calling that W. Capital W. Capital M is money earned from when we fold later in the hand after betting now, and this will obviously be negative. So we're betting now, our opponent is not folding, and then later in the hand, our opponent is betting or raising us, and we're folding. So we're losing some money from this, but so this will be a negative term. And then the variables relating to checking, we've got small s, which is the money earned at showdown after checking now. So it's the same as the capital S, but it's after we check now rather than after we bet now. And then we've got small w, which is money earned from villain folding later in the hand after we check now. So we check, more cards come, whatever it is, we bet later on, villain folds. All of that is encompassed in small w. And then we have small m, which is the money earned from us folding later in the hand after we check now. So again, this will be negative. We check now, later on villain bets, we fold, we lose money. So these are our variables, and we're going to put them together into a formula, which is relatively straightforward, although it looks a bit confusing because of all the letters flying about everywhere. So we bet when the EV bet minus the EV check is greater than or equal to 0. And this is the same as saying when the EV bet is greater than the EV check. We've just rearranged the inequality slightly. And then we've just put in these letters. So I put in our variables here. So we've got the ones in red. This is just the EV bet. So when the EV bet is when the EV bet minus the EV check, which is the green ones, is greater than or equal to 0, then we bet. And here we've just removed the brackets and just made these negative as a result. So we've got this formula, which is still just pretty much EV bet minus EV check. So why have we done this? Well, it's because I want to split these variables up in a different way. And we're going to call the two parts that I'm going to split it up into value equity and bluff equity. And this is kind of replacing our value equity. Sorry, this is kind of replacing value and bluff in the way of thinking about it. So we want to say that if our value equity plus our bluff equity is greater than 0, then we're going to bet. And I'm going to come to each of these individually in a minute, so I won't go into it more here. But to do this, we're going to split our small s, w, and m into SF, WF, MF, and SNF, WNF, MNF. And the F just denotes villain's hands which would have folded to a bet. And the NF denotes villain's hands which would not have folded to a bet. So I imagine some of you are a little bit confused at the second, but like at the moment, but in a second it will hopefully become clearer. So I'm just going to move on and hopefully we will get there. So value equity. And I could have described value equity and bluff equity. It might not be the best name for them really, but I didn't want to use just value and bluffs because then that's confusing for people, in later videos if they haven't watched this one yet or whatever. If I'm saying value and I mean something different from what they mean when they say value, I could have called this Jasmine and Dave value instead of value equity and bluff equity. But I kind of thought if someone doesn't watch this video and they like, oh, I wonder how to play like c-bet turn in a single raise pot, and they go watch this turn video, and I'm like, yeah, so we got kind of pretty decent Jasmine here, but really negative Dave, so I think we should probably just check. And they're going to be like, what the actual fuck have I just paid 1k for? So yeah, I thought I wouldn't do that, but we're calling it value equity and bluff equity. Call it something different if you like. So value equity we're going to define as the amount of money we earn after betting and villain continuing, so villain does not fold versus our bet, minus the amount of money we would have earned versus those same hands had we checked. And so you can see let's work out how to go back. Yeah. So you can see the variables that we're using to create this formula. So we've got all of the betting variables, like after we've bet, except for F, because we're ignoring now the equity we have from villain folding versus our bet, and we're just looking at the equity from later showdowns, later villain folds, and later us folds after we've bet. And then we're subtracting the amount of money that we win at showdown and after villain folds later in the hand and after we fold later in the hand after we check. And this NF, if you remember, is for those hands which were not folding versus our bet. So we're essentially comparing here the EV of betting, the set of hands that villain, versus the EV of betting our hand versus the set of hands that villain continues versus our bet, and then the EV of checking our hand versus those same set of hands, and we're calling this value equity. So this formula takes into account our EV versus all of villain's hands which will not fold to our initial bet. And the key point that I'm making here is that we're describing the increase in value gained by betting instead of checking, rather than just whether we get called by enough hands or whatever traditional idea of value you might have. So we're very much comparing betting and checking rather than just finding, oh, it's plus EV to bet, so I bet, but it could have been higher EV to check. So let's move on to bluff equity. And bluff equity uses the rest of the variables that haven't been used in value equity. And this, you kind of need that to be the case so that we're completely describing everything that can happen now or on future streets and we're not missing anything. So we have the F, which is the amount we earn from villain folding now versus the bet. And then we're subtracting the amount we would have made versus those same set of hands if villain had, if we checked instead of bet. So bluff equity is the amount of money earned by making hands fold now minus the amount of money we would have earned versus those hands if we had checked. And so this formula takes into account our EV versus all of villain's hands which will fold to the initial bet. So we've got value equity, takes into account the EV of versus villain's hands which are not folding versus a bet, and bluff equity, which is our EV versus villain's hands which will fold to the initial bet. And again, the key point is that we are describing whether we do better versus hands that fold to a bet now by betting now or by checking, rather than the incorrect method of just looking at whether a bluff is plus EV or not. Because a bluff could be plus EV, but it might be higher EV to check and see another card or whatever. So let's just kind of, I hope you've been following so far, but let's go into thinking about a couple of specific hand types just at the extremes, just to sort of get our heads around what we're saying here. So when we have the nuts, we will typically have very high value equity because we're talking about the part of villain's range. So we've got the nuts and we're looking at how the nuts does against the part of villain's range which is not folding versus a bet. So if we know that villain is not folding versus a bet and we have the nuts, kind of seems good to bet, right? So we're going to end up building a bigger pot than if we check and, you know, villain gets to see an extra card before there's any action, so we're in a smaller pot and so on. We got the nuts, we want to build a pot, nice and easy, very high value equity in general. The nuts will typically have a negative bluff equity though, since the bluff equity looks at the range of hands that villain is folding now to a bet. So if we bet with the nuts and we know villain is folding, that's not ideal. We're just winning the pot. Whereas if we check, then villain might put some money in themselves by betting now or if we're out of position or on future streets. So we're going to do better versus, like, especially if you think of the scenario where we have the nuts that can't be outdrawn, then we're guaranteed to do at least as well, and we will almost certainly do better by checking versus the range of hands that villain would be folding now if we bet. So when we've got the nuts, we want to think we've got very high value equity, but very negative bluff equity, and that's why we sometimes can end up checking the nuts in plenty of spots, obviously not in position on the river, but for example out of position on the flop. We call a button open in the big blind, flop the nuts, we will very often check and then go for a check raise or check call. And that's why, because our very negative bluff equity is balancing out our very positive value equity, because even in that spot, for example, obviously we do have very high value equity in betting, but yeah, the bluff equity cancels out. On the other side of the coin, we've got total air, and total air will have significantly negative value equity, since its EV of checking will be about 0, but its EV of betting versus a range of hands that never fold will be clearly negative. So yeah, I mean, this is probably kind of obvious. If value equity again is about the range of hands that villain's not folding, if we have total air, we know villain's not folding, we probably don't want to bet. On the other hand, total air will have significantly positive bluff equity, since if villain is folding versus a bet, if we know villain is folding versus a bet 100% of the time, and we have total air with no real chance of improving, obviously winning the pot is fantastic. And if we check, some of those hands are going to hit strong enough hands to continue on future streets and whatever else we're going to lose at showdown, and if we get there quite a bit and so on. So we're going to have significantly positive bluff equity there. So we want to think about every hand we hold as having these two components in its decision to bet, rather than just having this block of hands at the top, which is a bet, and then block of hands below, which is a check, and so on. We've got these two things to weigh up, and they can lead to the total air wanting to bet or check, and also the nuts wanting to bet or check based on these two balancing factors. And when we think of our more marginal hands in this light, we can really understand why poker doesn't work in this simple way of like I say, having this block of hands that bets and then below it a block that checks and so on, because other factors are coming into play. And we're going to look at those other factors in quite a bit more detail in the next video on frequencies and sizings, so I won't go into it a lot here. But, you know, things like we could have, say we've got bottom pair, but it's a deuce, and when villain folds, then we're getting two overcards to fold like all the time. So our bluff equity might be quite high with this bottom pair marginal hand, and we might want to end up betting it even though it's not a clear value bet in sort of the old sense of having this value and then average medium strength hands and then bluffs below it. So what should we take from all this? First of all, you're never going to want to be thinking about the details of this formula while you're playing. So I'm not trying to get you guys to sort of in your head be thinking like, oh, what's my S, what's my W, and so on in situations in game. This is very much a sort of exercise in understanding what's going on, so that in the background of everything you kind of have this good picture of how poker's working and why things are the way that they are. And then in future videos we'll obviously take this into a more practical sense and think about how we actually play at the tables. But like I say, you're not even going to want to use this formula away from the tables, in fact, because it does simplify if you would go to some river spot where you're playing shovel fold, then a lot of the terms will drop out and you could technically use this formula, but it wouldn't really be worth it anyway. You just use some other simple formula, and when you go back through the streets, it's just you're not going to be able to calculate these variables. It's totally unreasonable, and there's much better ways to work out how to play in a specific situation than trying to use this formula. But yeah, hopefully it provides a deep understanding of the theory behind what's going on and what we're going to be seeing later in the course when we're actually looking at solver results and sort of seeing how solvers play. So hopefully this will help us to understand why the solvers are playing the way that they do. And last thing I want to say was that not only do we need to think about this for our own bets, but we also need to ensure we aim to make our opponents indifferent between betting and checking with bluffs, rather than trying to make their bluff 0 EV. So this is something that people have made a mistake with in terms of minimum defense frequencies, where, for those of you who don't know what minimum defense frequencies are, there was an idea going around quite some time ago that, for example, if I c-bet pot, then, or let's do it the other way around, so if my opponent c-bets pot, then I need to continue versus their c-bet at least 50% of the time, because they are risking one pot with their bet to win one pot, which is in the middle. So if I fold more than 50% of the time, they can bet any two cards or even no cards at all profitably, because they are winning the pot more often than they are losing the pot that they're betting. So they have a plus EV bluff, if you like, with total air on the flop if I fold more than 50% of the time. However, when we understand this from the video, we know that if they just have a stronger range than us, for example, then their EV of checking is also going to be higher than 0 with total air, because we're still going to have a weak range after it flop checks through most of the time. They're going to be able to profitably bluff on future streets perhaps, or they're going to be able to hit some sort of rubbish pair sometimes, whatever it is, and they're going to have some EV after their check. So we actually can and usually should fold more than 50% of the time versus this pot c-bet, and that's something that not understanding this and the content of this video has caused people to play badly in a real sense at the tables. And it used to be very, very common for people to hold this misconception. I think it's a lot less common now, but still, hopefully it's certainly not a mistake that you guys will be making after seeing this. So that's everything on this video. I hope it wasn't too much of a headache and like too formula heavy for you, and we will be moving on to more practical stuff next. Like I say, the next video is going to be about frequencies and sizings, and we're going to be kind of taking some of the concepts from this and also just taking it much more into the real world of what we see on different, what we should be thinking about in terms of how to predict frequencies and sizings on different boards. So I'll see you all for that. Goodbye.